All right, human geography students, we are going to begin investigating Unit 3, and we're going to begin by looking at cultural patterns and processes. All right, so cultural geography and introduction. Cultural geography is an important component of the human geography course because culture is important to humans. The modification of the natural landscape by human activities is known as the cultural landscape. So examples of the human imprint on Earth include like this city landscape that you see down here in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. That is a human imprint on the Earth. None of this would exist without human beings. So examples include cities, houses, road systems, suburbs, to name a few. All right, cultural ecology. All right, cultural ecology, you'll remember this from our first unit of study. Cultural ecology is the field that studies the relationship between the natural environment and culture. This is known as cultural ecology. So this is where we're going to be touching back on possibilism and environmental determinism. All right, the cultural landscape is going to offer us clues about cultural practices and priorities of inhabitants, both past and present. So, for example, if you travel in Europe, you are going to notice that all roads in medieval towns lead directly to the church because the church was the priority of the inhabitants at the time. All right, another example of the cultural landscape is the cultural landscape in Peru. So this is the view of the Sacred Valley near Cusco, and this reflects cultural adaptation to the natural environment of the mountain valley. So you see the human imprint in the valley with lots of buildings, and then if we were to zoom in on this, you would see the importance of religion and importance of native customs if you were to be walking around on the streets and see native markets, as well as lots of evidence of Catholicism with lots of Catholic churches. All right, so schools of thought in cultural geography, we're going to talk about a couple of important geographers. And then we're also going to, again, touch back on environmental determinism and possibilism. So we're going to begin with environmental determinism. And just to review, environmental determinism is the belief that the physical environment, especially the climate and terrain, actively shapes culture. So this is the earliest school of thought in cultural ecology, and it is basically the school of thought that says that the environment is the most important factor in how humans evolve and adapt. So human responses are molded almost entirely by the environment. Some human choice can be impactful, but the most impactful thing in human living, in the human imprint, is the environment. Similar environments tend to produce similar cultures. So, for example, regardless of language, religion, other cultural factors, people who live near coasts tend to focus their industry on fishing and navigating waterways. Another example is that temperate or mild climates produce inventive, industrious, and democratic societies that are most likely to control others. And this school of thought was popular during the early 20th century, so the early 1900s, especially among English-speaking geographers who used their perspective to explain why Britain came to dominate the globe. So in the early 20th century, the sun never set on the British Empire. They still controlled colonies all over the world, including India. And the saying was that the sun never set on the British Empire. All right, so we've talked about environmental determinism. Let's review possibilism. This is the school of thought that holds that cultural heritage is as important as the physical environment in terms of shaping human behavior. So the human involvement is as important as the environment. The physical environment offers many possibilities for a culture to develop, but it is the people that are the primary architects of their culture. To continue with possibilism, people make choices based on their environment, but they are also guided by their cultural heritage. Possibilists believe that technology increases the number of options people have. So technologically advanced cultures have more control over their physical surroundings. And you can see evidence of that if you have air conditioning in your home, if you use a heater in the wintertime, if you preserve food in a refrigerator, if you use technology to communicate with people. You can see how technology can eliminate some of the negative effects of the environment. The next concept we're going to talk about is environmental perception. This school of thought emphasizes the importance of human perception. So if you don't know what a perception is a belief that you have about something. It's all in your head, how you perceive a situation. So this school of thought emphasizes the importance of human perception of the environment rather than the actual character of the land. So mind over matter, so to speak. For instance, how do humans view natural disasters? Cultures shape our view of hazards and natural disasters. And as a result, human reactions to these events vary based on the culture in which these natural disasters take place. All right, so for example, if people believe that a flood was caused by the gods, they are more likely to spend their time and their efforts trying to please the gods. Example, build an altar, present religious ceremonies, anything to do to alleviate the anger of the gods and prevent the natural disaster from occurring again. If people believe that the flood was a natural disaster, meaning naturally occurring, then they may work to prevent future damage, like build flood walls. So if culturally they tend to believe that these events are created by religious beings, they're going to react in a religious way. If they believe that it's a natural occurrence, then they're going to react maybe in a more practical way. All right, the next concept is cultural determinism. This perspective emphasizes human culture as ultimately more important than the physical environment in shaping or molding human actions. So some cultural determinists have seen humans in opposition to the environment, and if nature is not controlled, humans will die. All right, modern movements encourage action, for example, to reverse global warming, to reverse air and water pollution, and to slow or cease the destruction of the rainforests. All right, so from these schools of thought, we're going to move on to concepts of culture. All right, so what is culture? A basic definition is culture is the complex mix of values, beliefs, behaviors, and material objects that together form a people's way of life. Geographers specialize in the way that culture affects the natural environment as well as, again, the spatial organization that culture stimulates. Culture is divided into two types, non-material and material. So you have non-material culture and material culture. Non-material culture. This type of culture consists of abstract concepts of values, beliefs, and behaviors. So values are culturally defined standards that guide the way people assess goodness and beauty and serve as guidelines for moral living. So again, these are culturally defined. Beliefs. These are specific statements that people hold to be true, and behaviors, actions that people take. Material culture. This type of culture includes concrete human creations called artifacts, so basically things you can touch. Artifacts reflect the values, beliefs, and behaviors, so artifacts will reflect the non-material culture. Material culture is reflected in a variety of ways, from the way homes are constructed to what equipment is used for construction and the arrangement of roadways. All right, so this is a photo of a modern-day French village. The narrow streets were built in an earlier time when people traveled by foot, animal, or wagon. The motorcycle parked by its owner's door is a reflection of modern technology's adaptation to material culture. So you have a small motorcycle to help you better navigate winding streets, to sustain and live in a house that doesn't have a garage, and to deal with a small city that probably doesn't have a lot of on-street and off-street parking. All right, so key points to remember about non-material and material culture. Non-material culture is an abstract concept, so non-material means something you cannot touch. It consists of values, beliefs, and behaviors. Non-material culture tends to establish norms, the rules and expectations by which a society guides the behavior of its members. So much like we have classroom norms, non-material culture establishes norms for the members of its culture. Material culture are concrete human creations, so things you can touch. And they consist of artifacts like houses, churches, roadways, and the arrangement of buildings on the cultural landscape. So for example, all of these images, take a moment and see if you can connect each of these images to concepts that I talked about in the first half of this presentation. All right, so culture regions. Culture ties directly to geography's emphasis on space with the concept of cultural region or culture region. So what is a culture region? It is an area marked by culture that distinguishes it from other regions. Culture traits. A culture trait is a single attribute of culture. A culture region consists of countless interrelated traits. All right, so when we combine the two concepts, for example, the Andes Mountains in South America, these traits help to shape the culture region. They have colorful clothing with the group's skillful weave and design, building of roads and bridges across mountain ranges to adapt to the mountainous terrain. They construct buildings without mortar because that's not readily available to them. They terrace the land in order to grow crops. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you see an image of terracing. So when you think of mountains, mountains exist on, create very sharp, steep inclines. It's very difficult to farm. So the Incas introduced terracing. All right, more about culture traits. So culture traits are not necessarily confined to a single culture. So for example, terracing is not confined to the Andes Mountain regions. Another example is that people in many cultures use brushes to clean their teeth. However, the trait combines with others in a distinctive way so that a culture complex is formed. A culture complex consists of common values, beliefs, behaviors, and artifacts. So culture complex is essentially a combination of material and non-material culture. And a country may possess many cultural complexes, and we see this in China. In the modern-day city of Xi'an, you see a combination of religions and beliefs such as Buddhism, Islam, and Confucianism in ways that makes it a separate culture complex. However, certain traits such as Confucianism are shared by other complexes around the city. So we're going to move on to culture system. An area with a strong cultural tie that binds its people together forms a cultural system. A cultural system is a group of interrelated cultural complexes. So you see, we started out when we started talking about this concept, we started out with really small, and then now we're growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and from complexes to system. All right, cultural hearths. A hearth is a point of origin, and you'll remember this from our discussion on diffusion. In just a moment, we're going to review diffusion because diffusion is a very important part of the culture unit. And cultural hearths are areas where civilizations first began. They radiated customs, innovations, and ideologies that transformed the world. We find cultural hearths our early cultural hearths emerged after the Neolithic Revolution in Southwest Asia, North Africa, South Asia, and East Asia. Our earliest cultural hearths were almost completely determined by their geographical location. To the extent that they were located in river valleys. All of these civilizations were in river valleys where the soil was most fertile and water was most available for growing crops and transportation. So in northern Africa, we have the Egyptian civilization, which emerges around the Nile River. In the Middle East, Mesopotamia grows up around the Tigris and Euphrates River. The Indus River Valley civilization grows up around the Indus River. And early Asian cultural hearth emerges around the Yellow River. We also have the early Aegean cultural hearth. This cultural hearth differed from earlier hearths in that it centered on the Aegean Sea and not on a river valley. The sea is calm and the islands numerous, allowing for easy transportation so that ancient Greeks could trade for goods that their natural environment did not provide. So you have the four main river valley civilizations occurring not long after the Neolithic Revolution, followed by the ancient Greeks. All right, so from their centers, cultural hearths grew until they came into contact with one another. The ability to travel and come into contact with one another was limited by distance and level of technology. Cultural hearths have shifted greatly over time, so they are no longer located where they once were. So for example, the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries shifted cultural hearths to Europe and North America, with modern shifts in the 21st century continuing to occur. And so now we're going to come back to a topic we learned about in Unit 1. We're going to get into diffusion and specifically cultural diffusion. All right, so cultural diffusion, what is it? It is the process whereby culture spreads from its hearth to other areas. The long and complicated spread of culture often makes it difficult to trace the origin, spread, and timing of a particular trait. Developments occasionally can be traced to a specific civilization, and these developments are known as independent inventions. For example, the democratic process of gathering assemblies to discuss and vote on issues is often seen as an independent invention of the Greeks. Diffusion occurs through the movement of people, goods, and ideas. This should sound a little bit familiar to you. All right, so famous geographers in diffusion, we have Karl Sauer. In 1952, he writes Agricultural Origins and Dispersals. and he focuses on the process of diffusion, particularly as it related to agriculture. Torsten Hagerstrand wrote about diffusion approximately the same time as Sauer. All right, so we're going to go back over some of the categories of diffusion. So if you'll remember, we have expansion diffusion and relocation diffusion, and then under expansion diffusion, we have contagious hierarchical. That should hopefully ring a bell. All right, expansion diffusion occurs when an innovation or idea develops in a source area or a hearth and remains strong there while spreading outward. So types of expansion diffusion, we have contagious diffusion. Almost all individuals in areas adjacent to the source region are affected. Direct contact between those in the source region and those in outlying areas is important. Examples could be contagious diseases such as the H1N1 flu virus or HIV. So HIV, I think, at times can also be used as an example of hierarchical diffusion, but for the purposes of culture, just understand that contagious diffusion requires the direct contact between those in the source region and those in outlying areas, and that another characteristic trait of contagious diffusion is almost all individuals in areas adjacent to the source region are affected. Hierarchical diffusion. This is the Oprah effect diffusion. Ideas and artifacts spread first between larger places or prominent people and only later to smaller places or less prominent people. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the religion of Islam diffused to the regions through kings and nobility. So as the people higher up in the social ladder adopted Islam, it then was adopted by people lower down on the social ladder. So kings and nobility adopted first, later their subjects converted to Islam after giving up their native religions. Stimulus diffusion. The stimulus diffusion occurs when a basic idea, but not the specific trait, spreads to another area or region. It stimulates imitative behavior within a population. So an example, mainland Asia to Japan. As Buddhism diffused from the mainland to Japan, the Japanese imitated designs for Buddhist temples. However, interpretations of colors were from verbal or written descriptions and often differed from the temples in China. And I'm using some religious examples because as we move through this unit, we're going to talk pretty extensively about religion. All right, relocation diffusion. This is when individuals or populations migrating from the source or hearth areas physically carry the innovation or idea to new areas. An example, again, we're going to use a religious example. Christian Europeans carried their faith to the Americas where they often actively sought to convert the natives. All right, a form of relocation diffusion is migrant diffusion, which occurs when the spread of cultural traits is slow enough that they weaken in the area of origin by the time they reach other areas. So, for example, contagious diseases that reach the Native Americans in the New World. And an example of this would be smallpox. So when the conquistadors and the Spaniards first arrive in the New World, they bring with them lots of germs, and some of these germs included smallpox. Smallpox was absolutely devastating to the native population. Smallpox had already wreaked havoc on the European population, and many of the Europeans had developed a level of immunity to it. So the strength of smallpox had weakened in the hearth, in the origin of Europe, but it was incredibly strong in the New World upon arrival when the Europeans showed up. The rate of diffusion. So diffusion can occur instantly. However, the rate sorry about that. Somebody must have come to the door. So the dog's freaked out. Shh. Okay, they're almost as loud as you guys. Okay, so we are going to continue going. All right, so the rate of diffusion can occur instantly. However, the rate of diffusion is influenced by time distance decay. This means that the influence of the cultural traits weakens as time and distance increase. All right, so key terms from this session that you need to be able to define: cultural geography, cultural landscape, cultural ecology, environmental determinism, possibilism, environmental perception, cultural determinism, culture, non-material culture, material culture, culture regions, culture traits, culture complex, culture hearths, cultural diffusion, independent invention, expansion diffusion, relocation diffusion, contagious diffusion, stimulus diffusion, migrant diffusion, and time distance decay.